looking here at Galatians chapter 2, and I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 10. Then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. It was because of the revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of the reputation, for fear that I might be run or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked out to spy our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. But those who were of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. While those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me, but on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles, and recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to the pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. They only asked for us to remember the poor, the very thing that I was also eager to do. So we have Paul here going up to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and the apostles. It's sometimes called the Council of Jerusalem. He presents his gospel to the leaders, not that fear that his gospel was false, but because he knew he received it from God. But he did have fears that the leaders did not accept his gospel as truth. It would destroy all the previous work that he had done. That's why he said that I might be running or had run in vain. Verse 3, it says, but not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Titus went with Paul, basically, here's Exhibit A. Here's a Gentile that did not feel it necessary to be circumcised. This is very important because Paul is showing how the gospel is it's being saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. It's not by keeping the law. So Paul fights this with all of his strength because, if he gave in, it really destroyed everything he's done, because everything he's said is you're saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And anytime a false doctrine tries to sneak in, it starts subtly. They don't come in screaming that, hey, I don't like God. They, like this group here, it was a simple circumcision, which was really, it seemed not that big a deal, but it was really looking back to the law of Moses. And it was a public first step showing that you're going to follow the law. You're going to be obedient to the entire law. So that's what they were doing there. It seemed kind of subtle. They're like, yeah, it's grace through faith, but let's do this also. But and it's really those who are pushing for it. They're trying to put the people to be a slave, just so they can lord over them. That's really what they're after. Verse 4. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. So a false brethren is one who claims to believe the Christian faith, but truly does not. And sadly, there are these people in many churches throughout the your country. They do a good job at keeping the church ineffective for Christ. So they secretly slip in, and usually they're very charismatic, very popular. Everyone loves them, but they don't love Christ. They love works, and they love ruling. So really, they just came in to spy out. It's with evil intent. is really the word there. Spy out the liberty, the freedom that they had. And it was to make them a slave, to put them in bondage. It's really to gain control over someone and to make someone subservient to one's own interest. And, think about it. If you were a slave, would you willingly go to someone you love and say, hey, come be a slave with me? You wouldn't do that. So it's really a power trip is what it is. If they can get you to do what they tell you to do. So when you require the law as part of your salvation, it places you under a yoke of slavery, because no one's able to keep the commands of law. And later in chapters 3 and 4, Paul argues this. The one who wants to keep the law uses it as a checklist. Whether they know they can't keep it perfectly, but if they compare it to you or to Joe or to Susie or whatever, they're like, oh yeah, I'm better than them. And, that's where we get our little Pharisees within the church. So these false brothers did not sneak in to observe the freedoms like they were interested, like, oh, hey, that's a good thing. But, they want to put everyone under bondage. They didn't want to be free. They like the bondage. So there's really no love for the brothers. Otherwise, they wouldn't have people do it. So freedom is a major theme in Galatians, and it contrasts slavery. Verse 5. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. If Paul gave in that Gentiles had to be circumcised to be saved, it just would have showed his gospel to be false. And, that's one of the reasons why he fought it so hard. Verse 6, but those who are of high reputation, what they are makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality, while those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. So this group of high reputation added nothing to his gospel. They recognized that Paul was preaching the same gospel as they were. They didn't say, yeah, Paul, you're right, but make sure you do this also. But, Paul's not a people pleaser. And, even with those at the council at Jerusalem, I don't think he felt he needed their approval because he was confident that he was doing what God told him. But, he did have the hopes that he heard correctly from God and that this group was following God and would confirm him. Because let's say if Peter and them went off not following God, and then they turn around and say that Paul's wrong, it's going to ruin everything that Paul had done. So he did have some fears there. And it just shows, his humanity. But we see that these leaders agreed with his gospel, and they didn't add anything to it. Verse 7 and 8. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked also unto the Gentiles. So, Paul knew that he was to chase after the Gentiles, and that Paul had been given authority. And what we're seeing there when they're talking about circumcised and uncircumcised, it's really two different cultures. We have the Gentiles and the Jews. They're not different gospels. It's the same gospel that goes back to Abraham. It's faith. Verse 9. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to the pillars, gave to me Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So the apostles accepted Paul's apostleship, And right hand of fellowship really means they shook hand in agreement. They're saying, we're on the same team, is what they're saying. And, Paul was really hoping for that. Though he knew he was doing what God told him, that he didn't have fear for the men, but he was really hoping that they were preaching the same gospel as him. And, if you want to say that they didn't add anything, but it's just mostly a reminder, verse 10, they only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing that I was also eager to do. So it was showing that, Paul was already doing that. And so, he wanted Paul to continually remember the poor. And, this goes back to Luke 4, where Jesus came to preach the gospel to the poor. And it's those who have little money or few possessions or not having enough money for basic things that, people need to live properly. So, for here, it's for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And, when we think of poor, who is our poor? Is it those who are homeless on the side of the road? It could be if you're going to take a meal to them and sit down and present the gospel to them. Yeah, sure. I think that would fall under here. Is it to give them money? No, absolutely not. You do not give people money who are bad with money. They will take that money and go get high or get drunk or do things they shouldn't do, and it's going to throw them deeper into the pit that they're in. Now, you might drive away feeling good. Hey, I gave $20 to a guy, but you don't have any love for that guy because you just sent him deeper into his mess. So if you want to help the homeless, get involved with them. Go have a meal with them, sit down with them, talk to them. So is this to believers then? I think it's either way, believers or unbelievers, I think you need to have some type of involvement of knowing where they're really at. Because if you want to talk money, years ago I worked as a union truck driver. We all made the same money, worked the same hours. And I felt like I was living like a king, how much money we're making. But most people were just frantic that they didn't have enough money, to pay bills or to get groceries this week. And so you need to be involved in people's life to understand when it comes to money. I was thinking back to, I went back to school when I already had kids, married and kids, and so we cut back our lifestyle, and I'd started a business, and we're getting by, just barely getting by, and I had a customer that knew that we didn't have much money, but she would always find little odd jobs for me, and so that gave me more money to provide. But she would also buy little things and give to me, say like a fancy jelly. Yeah, I can go afford a jelly, but you always bought the cheaper one. But she would buy a fancy flavored one or something. It was kind of refreshing to the soul, her way of giving to the poor, really. So there are ways to give to the poor without driving them deeper into their mess. In all societies, there are poor people, people who are lacking either material possessions or money, and there's some, even essentials of food, clean water, sanitation, clothing, just basic shelter, healthcare, education. So, look out to help the poor in a way that you can do that. And, like what Paul says there, he was eager to, something hurriedly, that he had some energy behind. Hey, I want to help these people. I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to just hand them money so I feel good, and then they go off deeper in their sin without knowing Christ. So Paul sees it necessary as living out the gospel, as helping the poor. So just don't hand out money or even be motivated out of fear to preach the gospel. Get involved in the lives of those you want to help and see where they really need help. Because otherwise you could hurt them. And, kind of key there, you want to love your brothers. So thanks for watching.